The ache in Clara's feet was a familiar, constant companion. It started around her ankles and slowly climbed up her shins as the night wore on, a dull, throbbing reminder of the miles she had walked within the four greasy walls of the diner. It was 3 in the morning and the world outside was dark and quiet, but in here, under the relentless buzz of the fluorescent lights, a different kind of life was just trying to survive. The air was a thick cocktail of stale coffee, fried onions, and the sweet, cloying scent of maple syrup from the breakfast shift that was still hours away. It was a smell that clung to her clothes, her hair, and she felt her very soul. She moved with a practiced efficiency that was almost second nature, her body on autopilot while her mind raced through a never-ending list of worries. Wiping down a sticky table with a damp cloth, she mentally added the cost of the electricity bill to the pile. It was due next week. Then there was the rent for the small 2-bedroom apartment that felt less like a home and more like a temporary shelter. But the biggest number, the one that woke her up in a cold sweat in the few hours she managed to sleep, was the hospital bill. It was a monster of a number, printed in stark black ink on crisp white paper, a constant reminder of the scariest night of her life. Her son, Leo, was the reason for everything. He was at home now, tucked into bed, breathing easily. But just a few months ago, his breath had come in short, terrifying gasps. She could still hear the sound, a little wheeze that had escalated into a desperate struggle for air. The frantic drive to the emergency room, the blur of doctors and nurses, the feeling of absolute helplessness as she watched her little boy, his small chest heaving, connected to a nebulizer. He was fine now, thank God, but the aftermath was a mountain of debt that seemed to grow taller with every passing day. This graveyard shift at the diner and the early morning shift at the coffee shop were her only tools to chip away at that mountain. A loud clatter from the kitchen made her jump. It was just Joe, the cook, dropping a metal spatula. He grumbled a curse word under his breath. He was a big man with a greasy apron and a permanent frown, but she knew he had a soft spot. He'd once slipped her an extra order of fries to take home for Leo when she'd mentioned they were running low on groceries. She gave him a small, tired smile, and he just nodded in return, his focus already back on the grill. They didn't need many words. They were both just soldiers in the same late-night war, trying to get through their shift. The main worry of the night, besides the bills, was her car. It was an old, beat-up sedan that had seen better days. On her drive to work, she'd heard a new sound, a deep, worrying, clunking noise from the front end. Every time she turned a corner, it was there, a sound that screamed expensive repair. She couldn't afford a new transmission. She couldn't even afford a minor repair. The car was her lifeline. Without it, she couldn't get to this job or her other one. Without it, she couldn't get Leo to his doctor's appointments. The thought of it breaking down on some dark, empty road sent a shiver of fear down her spine. A fear that was colder than the cheap air conditioning blowing from the vent above her. The diner was mostly empty now. A couple of truckers sat in a corner booth, hunched over cups of black coffee, speaking in low tones. A young man with headphones sat at the counter, typing furiously on a laptop, his face illuminated by the screen. These were the night people, the ghosts of the city, and she was their server. She refilled their coffee and water, her movements smooth and silent. She had perfected the art of being invisible, of anticipating needs before they were spoken. It was a skill she had learned not just for her job, but for life. Being a single mom meant you had to be prepared for everything, to anticipate every need, every problem, every scraped knee or fever. She pulled her phone from the pocket of her apron, the screen lighting up her tired face. The wallpaper was a picture of Leo from the summer, his face split by a wide, gap-toothed grin as he held up a sandcastle he had built. He looked so happy, so carefree. It was the reason she was here, in this greasy spoon, her feet aching and her heart heavy. There was a text message from the babysitter, an older woman from down the hall. "He's sleeping soundly. No problems. Don't you worry." A wave of relief washed over her, so powerful it almost made her knees buckle. It was a small victory, but in her world, small victories were everything. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and took a deep breath, the smell of grease filling her lungs. The exhaustion was bone deep, a kind that a full night's sleep couldn't fix. It was the exhaustion of constant worry, of carrying the weight of her small world on her shoulders. But looking at the empty tables, the quiet customers, and thinking of her sleeping son, she felt a flicker of something else. It wasn't strength, not really. It was just resolve. A quiet, stubborn determination to keep going, to keep putting one foot in front of the other, to keep serving coffee and clearing tables because that's what moms do. She straightened her back, put on her well-worn smile, and prepared for the next customer to walk through the door. The clock on the wall seemed to be moving backwards, its hands creeping with a painful slowness that matched the throb in Clara's temples. It was that time of night around 2 a.m. when the world felt like it had been paused. The initial rush of post-bar crowds had faded, and the early bird breakfast crowd was still a distant dream. All that was left was the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the soft, rhythmic ticking of that cursed clock. She was wiping down the counter for what felt like the 10th time, her movements slow and mechanical, her mind a million miles away. She was thinking about the sound her car had made again, that horrible clunking sound that echoed the feeling in her own chest. She was trying to do the math in her head, figuring out how many hours she would need to work to cover a repair that could cost anywhere from a few hundred to a few $1,000s. The numbers just didn't add up. They never did. She was so lost in her worried calculations that the sudden, cheerful chime of the bell above the door made her jump. It was a sound that usually meant business, a new customer, a potential tip. But at this hour, it was an anomaly. She looked up, her hand still holding the damp rag, expecting to see a tired-looking trucker or maybe a couple of college students pulling an all-nighter. But the figure that stepped in from the darkness was different. He was tall and slender, dressed in simple jeans and a dark hoodie. A black beanie was pulled low over his forehead, and a pair of dark sunglasses were perched on his nose, sunglasses at 2 a.m. Clara's internal alarm bells, dulled by exhaustion, gave a faint, half-hearted ring. Weirdo, she thought, or maybe someone trying to hide a black eye. She'd seen it all before. He didn't look around. He just walked with a quiet, purposeful stride toward the back of the diner, sliding into a booth in her section. The one with the torn vinyl seat that she always forgot to get fixed. He sat with his back to the wall, facing the door, a habit she'd seen in people who were either in law enforcement or just constantly on edge. He placed his hands flat on the table in front of him, fingers long and still. There was an air of stillness about him, a calm that felt out of place in the greasy, frantic energy of the diner. Clara sighed, tucked her rag into her apron, and grabbed a menu. Her feet protested with every step, a sharp pain shooting up from her heels. She pasted on her tired, customer service smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. As she got closer, something about the man's face, even half hidden as it was, tickled a memory in the back of her mind. It was like seeing a ghost from a movie she'd watched a long time ago. She pushed the thought aside. Her brain was just tired, playing tricks on her. "Hi there," she said, her voice a little raspy. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" The man looked up, and as he tilted his head, the light from the fixture above caught his face just right. And in that instant, the ghost from the movie came into sharp, shocking focus. It wasn't a ghost. It was him, Keanu Reeves. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart did a little flip-flop, a sudden jolt of adrenaline cutting through the thick fog of her fatigue. Her mind raced. What was he doing here? In this dingy little diner in the middle of nowhere? It was him. The same sad eyes, the same kind mouth. It was unmistakable. She fought to keep her expression neutral, to maintain the professional mask she had worn for so many years. It was a battle. Her smile suddenly felt fake and brittle. She had to pretend she didn't know. She had to treat him like any other customer. It was a matter of respect, of not adding to the chaos of his life. She could only imagine what it was like to be him, to never have a moment of peace. So she just stood there, holding the menu. Her hand suddenly feeling a little shaky, he looked at her, and his eyes, even behind the dark glasses, seemed to hold a deep weariness that mirrored her own. It was a strange and surprising connection. He wasn't the action hero from the movies or the quirky character from the comedies. He was just a tired man sitting in a booth. "Just a coffee, please," he said. His voice was quiet, soft, and a little rough around the edges. "And maybe a burger. Whatever you recommend." Clara nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Sure, coming right up." She placed the menu on the table, her fingers brushing against the laminated plastic. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her legs feeling a little unsteady. She felt a giddy, surreal energy bubbling up inside her. She wanted to turn around and look again, just to make sure she wasn't dreaming. But she didn't. She just kept walking. She gave the order to Joe, who grunted in acknowledgement, not even looking up from the grill. She leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She felt like a teenager again, with a silly crush. But it was more than that. It was the sheer strangeness of it all. Here she was, a struggling single mom worrying about car transmissions, and John Wick was sitting in booth number 7, waiting for a burger. She poured the coffee, her hands much steadier now. The rich, dark aroma filled her senses, grounding her. She carried the mug back to his table, her steps deliberate and calm. She was a professional. She could do this. She placed the mug down in front of him, a small clink of ceramic on the saucer. "Your burger will be ready in a few minutes," she said. Her voice even. "Thank you," he said, and he gave her a small, genuine smile. It was a kind smile, a smile that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. It completely transformed his face. She went about her work, wiping down tables, refilling salt shakers, but she couldn't stop herself from glancing over at his booth. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, looking out the window at the empty street. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't seem impatient. He was just waiting, quietly. There was no entourage, no fuss. He was just a man, alone in a diner in the middle of the night. It was the most normal thing and the most bizarre thing she had ever seen. A few minutes later, Joe slid a plate across the pass. "Burger's up," he grunted. Clara placed the simple burger and a side of fries on a tray and carried it over. The smell of grilled meat and fried potatoes was a comforting, familiar scent. "Here you go," she said, placing the plate in front of him. "It looks great," he said. "Thank you." She lingered for a moment, wanting to say something, anything, but not knowing what. "What do you say to someone you've only ever seen on a screen? Enjoy your movie? No? Big fan? Too cliché." So she just stood there, feeling awkward. He must have sensed her hesitation. He looked up from his burger. "Long night?" he asked. His voice, gentle. The question caught her off guard. It was such a simple, normal thing to ask, but coming from him, it felt strangely profound. Her filter, worn thin by exhaustion and stress, completely failed. The words just tumbled out before she could stop them. "You have no idea," she said with a short, humorless laugh. "It's been one of those nights. Trying to save up for a new transmission, so every tip counts. Makes it hard to relax, you know?" As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she regretted it. She sounded like she was complaining, like she was fishing for something. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up her neck. She shouldn't have said that. It was unprofessional, but he didn't look annoyed or uncomfortable. He just nodded slowly, his expression full of a quiet understanding that was more comforting than any platitude. He didn't offer pity or empty words. He just looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "I hear you. Hang in there." And that was it. Just 4 simple words. But they landed with the weight of something much more. It wasn't a solution. It didn't fix her car or pay her bills. But it was a moment of genuine human connection. A flicker of empathy from a complete stranger, a famous one at that, who saw past the tired waitress and recognized a fellow human being just trying to get through the night. She felt a lump form in her throat, and she just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She gave him a small, grateful smile and walked away, the weight on her shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. The words "hang in there" echoed in Clara's mind long after she had walked away from the booth. They were such simple, common words, the kind people say without really thinking. But coming from him, they felt different. They felt heavy with a genuine understanding that was both comforting and unsettling. She went back to her work, her hands moving automatically, but her thoughts were no longer on the mounting bills or the sickening clunk of her car. They were on the quiet man in booth number 7. She found herself watching him from the corner of her eye as she wiped down the sugar dispensers. He ate his burger slowly, methodically, as if he was truly savoring each bite. There was no rush, no sense of a famous person eager to get back to their important life. He was just a man eating a simple meal in a quiet diner. It was strangely peaceful to watch. She refilled the coffee for the 2 truckers in the corner, their low conversation a steady murmur against the hum of the refrigerator. She cleared a table left by a couple who had come in for a late-night snack, their half-eaten plate of fries a testament to their haste. With every task, her awareness of him remained, a quiet presence at the edge of her consciousness. She felt a strange sense of protectiveness, a desire to make sure no one else bothered him. Not that anyone seemed to notice. The other patrons were lost in their own worlds, their own late-night struggles and distractions. He was just another shadow in the corner, and she was glad for that. After what felt like a long time. He pushed his empty plate away and took a final sip of his coffee. He placed the mug down carefully, the small clink barely audible. He didn't wave her over or call out. He just sat there for a moment, looking out the window at the empty street, where the first hint of a gray morning was just beginning to stain the sky. Then he stood up, pulling his beanie a little lower over his forehead. He walked toward the counter. His footsteps soft on the worn linoleum floor. Clara met him at the register, her heart beating a little faster. She felt a nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. "All finished?" she asked, her voice sounding a little too bright. "Yes, thank you," he said. It was exactly what I needed. He pulled a credit card from his wallet and handed it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing against his for a brief second. His hand was warm. She glanced down at the card. It had a completely normal name on it, one she didn't recognize. Of course it would. She ran the card, the machine whirring and spitting out the receipt. He signed it with a quick, scribbled signature while the machine was processing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. He dropped them into the big glass tip jar on the counter. It wasn't a huge amount, maybe $5 or $10. A normal, modest tip for a normal meal. It was so normal, it almost made her laugh. Here was a man who could probably buy the entire diner without a second thought, and he was leaving a standard, everyday tip. It just added to the strangeness and the humility of his presence. She handed him his copy of the receipt. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you," he replied, and he gave her that same small, genuine smile from before. It wasn't a big Hollywood smile. It was a quiet, kind expression that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. It was a smile that said, "I see you." Then he turned and walked toward the door, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. He pushed it open and stepped out into the cool pre-dawn air, disappearing into the gray light without a backward glance. The bell above the door chimed softly, and then silence descended once more. Clara stood at the counter for a moment, just looking at the empty doorway. It felt like a dream, like a weird little movie that had played out in the middle of her shift. But the signed receipt in her hand and the few extra dollars in the tip jar were proof that it had been real. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The magical moment was over. It was time to get back to reality. Her reality was a dirty table and a long list of worries. She grabbed her cleaning rag and a bus tub and headed over to booth number 7. As she walked, her mind was already shifting back to its default setting. The car. The Bill's Leo. She had to pick him up in a few hours, and she was dreading that drive, listening for the clunking sound with every turn of the wheel. The brief, strange encounter with the famous actor was already fading, becoming a distant memory as the heavy weight of her life settled. Back onto her shoulders, she reached the booth and started clearing the plates. The half-eaten pickles, the crumpled napkin he had used to wipe his mouth. She stacked them efficiently in her tub. She picked up his coffee mug, the ceramic still warm from his last sip. Underneath the mug was a folded white napkin. She sighed, a little annoyed. People always left their trash on the table. She reached for it, intending to toss it into the tub with the rest of the mess, but as her fingers closed around it, she stopped. It felt heavy, too heavy for a simple paper napkin. A flicker of confusion went through her. She picked it up. It was folded into a neat, thick square. It had a surprising weight to it, a dense, solid feel that was completely wrong. Her heart started to beat a little faster. She unfolded the first layer of the napkin, then the next. And then she saw it was money. A thick, neat stack of bills, all $100 bills. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her hands began to tremble. She stared at it, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. This wasn't a tip. This was impossible. She quickly looked around the diner, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Surprise!" But no one was paying any attention. Joe was in the kitchen, the truckers were still in their corner, and the man with the laptop was typing away. She was alone in her little bubble of disbelief. With shaking fingers, she unfolded the napkin completely. The money was held together by a simple paper clip, and underneath the paper clip, there was something written on the napkin itself, in a neat, slightly slanted handwriting. It was a note. Her eyes scanned the words, her brain struggling to read them through the blur of tears that were suddenly welling up. For the car, her breath caught. He remembered. He had actually listened to her tired, rambling complaint, and he remembered. It wasn't just a polite nod. He heard her, and for being a great mom even when you're exhausted. A sob escaped her lips, a choked, strangled sound. She clapped a hand over her mouth, but it was too late. The tears were flowing freely now, hot and unstoppable, streaming down her face. He saw her. He didn't just see a tired waitress. He saw a mom. He saw the struggle. He saw the love and the exhaustion all mixed together. It was the most seen she had felt in years. Thank you for the coffee. The sheer humility of it, the simple gratitude for something so small, broke something open inside her. This man, this incredible person, was thanking her. Get some rest. It wasn't just advice. It was a blessing. A wish for her peace. And at the end, a simple, elegant K. She sank down into the booth, her legs no longer able to support her. She held the napkin in one hand and the thick stack of money in the other. The world outside the little booth faded away. The smell of the grease, the hum of the lights, the ache in her feet, it all disappeared. All she could see were the words on the napkin. All she could feel was the crushing, overwhelming weight of a kindness so profound it felt like a physical force. It wasn't just money. It was hope. It was a lifeline thrown to her in the middle of a dark, turbulent ocean. She leaned her head against the hard vinyl of the seat, the tears now coming in quiet, racking sobs that shook her entire body. It was the release of months, maybe years, of pent-up fear and stress and loneliness. In that moment, in that greasy little diner, as the sun began to rise on a new day, Clara felt a kind of peace she had forgotten was even possible. The sobs slowly quieted, fading into hiccups and ragged breaths. Clara sat hunched in the vinyl booth, the worn material sticking to her back. The world slowly came back into focus, but it was a different world than the one she had been living in just 10 minutes ago. The first light of dawn was creeping through the large front window of the diner, casting long, soft shadows across the greasy floor. It painted the scene in a gentle, almost holy light. She was still clutching the napkin, her knuckles white. In her other hand, she held the thick stack of $100 bills. They felt unreal, like prop money from a movie. The paper was crisp, the edges sharp, a stark contrast to the soft, crumpled napkin it was wrapped in. Her tears had smudged the ink of the note, but the words were burned into her memory. For the car, and for being a great mom. A floorboard creaked behind her. She stiffened, instantly afraid, a primal fear that someone would try to take this miracle away from her. She looked up, her vision still blurry. It was Joe, the cook. He stood there, a giant of a man with his greasy apron and a permanent scowl etched onto his face. But his eyes, usually narrowed with concentration or annoyance, were wide with concern. He held a spatula in his hand like a weapon. "You all right there?" He grumbled, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You look like you've seen a ghost?" Clara couldn't speak. She just shook her head, a fresh wave of tears welling up. She opened her trembling hand, showing him the money and the napkin. Joe leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. He squinted at the napkin, then his eyes drifted down to the stack of bills. His scowl didn't exactly disappear, but it changed. The hard lines around his mouth softened. He blinked once, then twice, as if his brain was trying to process the information. He looked from the money to her tear-streaked face and back again. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, more to himself than to her. He looked around the empty diner, then back at her. "Is that from him?" Clara could only nod, a sob catching in her throat. Joe straightened up and put a hand on her shoulder. It was a heavy, awkward gesture, but it was filled with a kindness that made her want to cry all over again. "Come on," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Let's get you out of sight." Into the back. He helped her up, her legs feeling like they were made of jelly. He guided her toward the swinging door that led to the kitchen, the heart of the diner. It was a world of stainless steel, clanging pans, and the constant low flame of the grill. It was hot and chaotic, but in that moment it felt like the safest place on earth. He led her to a small, cluttered office in the corner, a space she had rarely entered. He sat her down in a rickety chair and closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. "Okay," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Let's see it." With fingers that still wouldn't stop shaking, Clara placed the stack of bills on the messy desk. She carefully unclipped the paperclip and began to count. It was a strange, almost sacred ritual. Each bill was $100. 100. 200. 300. She counted slowly, methodically, her whisper barely audible in the small room. Joe watched in silence, his arms crossed over his chest. She counted one stack, then another, and another. The final number made her gasp. It was $5,000. $5,000. It was a number so large, so abstract, it didn't seem real. It was more than she made in 2 months. It was enough to fix her car, pay off the most urgent of Leo's medical bills, and still have enough left over to breathe for the first time in a long time. Joe let out a low whistle. "That's not a tip," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's a rescue." Clara just stared at the money, her mind reeling. It wasn't just the amount. It was the message. The note. He could have just left the money. It would have been an incredible, life-changing act of charity. But he didn't. He wrote the note. He saw her. He heard her tired, unguarded complaint about the car and her struggle, and he didn't just offer pity. He offered respect. For being a great mom even when you're exhausted. Those words were worth more than the money. They were a validation of every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every moment of bone-deep weariness she had pushed through for her son. It was a recognition of her invisible war and a sign that someone, a complete stranger, saw her as a warrior. She carefully folded the note and tucked it into her wallet, like a precious treasure. Then she began to stack the bills, neat and orderly, and slid them into her purse. The weight of it felt different now. It wasn't just a bag. It was a lifeline. "You got a place to keep that safe?" Joe asked, his practical nature cutting through her emotional haze. She nodded. Yeah. "Good," he said. "You finish your shift?" The question brought her back to reality. The shift. She still had an hour left. The idea of going back out there, of pretending everything was normal, felt impossible. But then again, what was normal anymore? She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of fried food and coffee. She felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The storm of tears had passed, leaving behind a quiet, profound sense of peace. "Yeah," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I can finish." As she walked back out into the diner, the world looked the same, but she felt completely different. The fluorescent lights didn't seem as harsh. The sticky tables didn't seem as grimy. The ache was still there in her feet, a dull throb that had been her constant companion for years, but it felt distant now, like an echo from another life. She moved with a new lightness, a quiet energy that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with hope. She refilled the trucker's coffee, and when one of them grumbled, thanks, she gave him a genuine, warm smile that reached all the way to her eyes. He looked up, surprised, and smiled back. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She went through the motions, but her mind was not on her tasks. It was on the incredible, impossible kindness of a stranger. She thought about the look in his eyes, the quiet weariness that mirrored her own. Maybe that's why he did it. Maybe he saw a piece of himself in her struggle. It wasn't about being a famous actor helping a poor waitress. It was about one human being seeing another in a moment of need and offering a hand, not out of pity, but out of a shared understanding of what it means to struggle when the morning shift arrived. A bubbly young woman with bright pink hair, Clara clocked out. She walked out of the diner into the cool morning air. The sun was fully up now, casting a golden glow on the city. It felt like a brand new day. She walked to her car, her heart thumping with a familiar anxiety. The clunking noise. She had forgotten all about it in the emotional chaos. She slid into the driver's seat, the worn fabric of familiar comfort. She put the key in the ignition, hesitating for just a second, and turned it. The engine roared to life. And there was no clunk. No horrible worrying sound. Just the smooth, steady purr of the engine. She let out a laugh, a loud, joyful, uninhibited laugh that echoed in the quiet parking lot. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated relief. She pulled out of the parking spot and onto the street, the car moving smoothly beneath her. The drive home was different. The buildings seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. The future, which had just hours ago felt like a dark, terrifying tunnel, now had a light at the end of it. A bright, warm, hopeful light. She was driving home to her son, not just as a struggling mom, but as a woman who had been reminded that magic was real and that sometimes it looked like a stack of $100 bills and a handwritten note on a napkin. The drive home was a dream. The old sedan, which had felt like a cage on wheels just hours before, now glided down the empty streets. The horrible clunking sound was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of an engine that was no longer threatening to give up at any moment. Clara kept glancing at the passenger seat, at her purse lying there. It felt heavier than it ever had before, not just with the weight of the money, but with the weight of a promise. A promise of a new beginning when she pulled into the parking spot outside her apartment building. The sun was higher now, painting the brick in a warm, golden light. She sat in the car for a long moment, just breathing. The world outside looked the same, but she felt like she was looking at it through a new pair of eyes. The anxiety that had been her constant companion, the tight knot in her chest, had loosened its grip. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a sense of space, of possibility. She quietly unlocked the door to her small apartment. The babysitter, a kind elderly woman from down the hall, was asleep in the armchair, a book open on her lap. Clara gently woke her, paid her, and thanked her profusely. After the woman left, Clara stood in the middle of the living room, the silence of the early morning wrapping around her. She tiptoed into Leo's room. He was sound asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. His little face was relaxed, free from the worry of the asthma attack that had haunted them for months. She watched him, her heart overflowing with a love so fierce it almost hurt. This was why she did everything. This little boy, sleeping peacefully in his bed, was her entire world. She backed out of the room quietly and went into the kitchen. She took the money out of her purse and the napkin note out of her wallet. She spread the bills out on the small, worn kitchen table. They looked so out of place, so bright and new against the scratched surface. She read the note again, her fingers tracing the neat, slanted handwriting. For the car, and for being a great mom even when you're exhausted. The words still felt like a warm blanket. She carefully folded the note and slid it into the pages of her favorite cookbook, a place she knew she would find it again and again. Then she found an old shoebox in the back of her closet. She placed the money inside, tucked it under a stack of old sweaters, and pushed it deep into the corner. It was her secret treasure, her safety net. The next morning, she woke up not to the sound of her alarm, but to the sound of her son's laughter. He was jumping on her bed, his energy boundless. "Mommy, wake up! It's morning." She opened her eyes and looked at his smiling face, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the immediate pang of dread about the day ahead. She just felt happy. Okay, I'm up," she laughed, pulling him into a hug. "What do you want for breakfast?" "Pancakes," he yelled. "With lots and lots of syrup." And she said yes. She didn't think about the cost of the extra syrup or the time it would take. She just enjoyed the simple joy of making pancakes for her son. Over the next few days, she began to untangle the knots of her life. She made a list. First, the car. She called the mechanic, a gruff man who had given her a quote that had made her stomach drop. She drove the car to his shop, her heart pounding a little. When he gave her the final bill, she took out the shoebox. She paid him in cash, in crisp $100 bills. The mechanic's eyes widened, but he didn't ask any questions. He just nodded, a look of respect on his face. When she drove the car away, it felt brand new. The steering was tight. The engine was quiet. It was no longer a source of fear, but a symbol of freedom. Next, the hospital bill. She had been making small, pathetic payments, barely making a dent in the huge total. She walked into the billing office, a place she had always avoided. She laid the stack of bills on the counter. The woman behind the desk looked at her, then at the money, her expression a mixture of shock and confusion. "I'd like to pay off my son's account," Clara said, her voice steady. The woman typed on her computer, her eyes growing wider. "All of it?" she asked. Clara nodded. All of it. When the receipt was printed, showing a balance of 0, Clara felt a weight lift off her shoulders that was so heavy, she hadn't even realized she was carrying it. She walked out of that office feeling 10 feet tall. She didn't go on a shopping spree. She didn't buy a new TV or fancy clothes. The money was for security, for peace of mind. But she did buy one thing for Leo. It was a small, toy robot he had been staring at longingly in the window of a toy store for weeks. It wasn't expensive, but it had been an impossible luxury. She walked into the store, bought the robot, and gave it to him when she got home. The look on his face, a mixture of pure shock and utter joy, was worth more than all the money in the world. He played with that robot for hours, and she sat with him, not thinking about work or bills, just enjoying the sound of his happy giggles. She never told anyone the full story. She didn't call a newspaper or a TV station. It felt too sacred, too personal. This incredible act of kindness was hers to hold on to. It was a shield against the cynicism of the world. The only person she ever told was Joe the cook. A few days later, when she was working her shift, he pulled her aside. "You okay?" he asked. She just nodded, a small smile on her face. "More than okay," she said. He understood. He didn't need any more details. They shared a secret, a quiet moment of acknowledgement that good things really did happen to good people. Sometimes in the most unexpected of ways. Her life didn't magically become perfect. She still worked 2 jobs. The shifts were still long and tiring. There were still days when she felt exhausted and overwhelmed. But the foundation of her life had changed. The constant, gnawing fear was gone. She had a cushion, a safety net. And more than that, she had the memory. On the hard days, she would pull out that memory like a talisman. She would remember the quiet man in the booth, the kind look in his eyes, and the simple, powerful words on a napkin. It reminded her that she was seen, that her struggle was recognized, and that there was goodness and kindness in the world. Even in the darkest, greasiest spoon of a diner. One evening, a few months later, she was sitting on a bench in the park, watching Leo play on the swings. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over everything. He was laughing, his hair flying in the breeze. She felt a deep sense of peace, a quiet contentment that she had never known before. The struggle was still there, in the background, but it no longer defined her. She was more than a struggling mom. She was a mom who had been shown an incredible kindness, a kindness that had given her not just money, but hope. And as she watched her son, so happy and so free, she sent a silent thank you out into the universe, to the quiet man who had seen her, and in doing so had given her back to herself.